I'm Ron Strauss, and I was Elvis's pilot from 75, 76, 77.
In the final days of Elvis Presley's life, few knew the king better than the man who flew him across America, his personal pilot, Ron Strauss. Years later, Strauss broke his silence, revealing haunting details about Elvis's final flight home. What he saw and heard that night offers a chilling glimpse into the legend's last moments of peace. The sky belonged to the king. It was in 1975 that Elvis Presley took delivery of his most extravagant possession yet, a Convair 880 jet that had once ferried passengers across continents for Delta Airlines. Now, after $1 million customization, it bore a new name painted in elegant script along its body, Lisa Marie, after his only daughter. The aircraft wasn't just a vehicle, it was a flying mansion, a sanctuary at 30,000 feet, and perhaps the last place on Earth where the king of rock and roll could still feel like a man instead of a monument. Inside, the Lisa Marie defied every expectation of commercial aviation. Gold-plated seatbelt buckles caught the light in the main cabin, where plush leather seats had been arranged more like a living room than an airplane interior. A conference room featured a custom-built table where Elvis could spread out contracts, scripts, or simply play cards with his inner circle. Further back, a bedroom suite offered a queen-sized bed with a seatbelt system, a detail that spoke to both luxury and practicality. The bathroom fixtures were trimmed in gold. A sophisticated sound system ran throughout the cabin. Every detail had been specified by Elvis himself, each choice reflecting not ostentation for its own sake, but a deep desire for comfort and privacy in the only space he could truly control. At the controls of this magnificent machine sat Captain Ron Strauss, a seasoned pilot who had logged thousands of hours before ever meeting Elvis Presley. Strauss came to the position through professional channels. Hired not for his ability to navigate the complex world of celebrity, but for his unquestionable skill in the cockpit and his reputation for discretion. In the beginning, he viewed the job as any other: transport the client safely from point A to point B, maintain the aircraft to the highest standards, and respect the boundaries between crew and passenger. But something shifted during those early flights. Elvis treated his flight crew not as servants but as trusted confidants, men whose presence he came to depend upon in ways that transcended their professional roles. The relationship that developed between Elvis and his pilot existed in a strange space between employer and friend, celebrity and caretaker. Strauss witnessed versions of Elvis Presley that the screaming crowds never saw. He watched the performer board the plane after exhausting concerts, makeup still smudged on his collar, moving with the heavy gait of someone far older than his years. He observed how Elvis would sometimes sit for hours without speaking, staring through the oval windows at the landscape sliding past below, the Mississippi Delta, the Rocky Mountains, the endless Nevada desert. In those moments, 30,000 feet above the world that had made him famous and isolated in equal measure, Elvis seemed to shed the weight of expectation that crushed him on the ground. The mid-1970s found Elvis at a complicated crossroads. His Vegas residencies continued to sell out, and his tours drew massive crowds hungry for even a glimpse of the legend. Yet those close to him recognized the toll these performances extracted. The voice that had once soared effortlessly now required tremendous effort to maintain. The lean, dangerous figure who had scandalized America in the 1950s had given way to a man battling weight gain, health problems, and a pharmacy's worth of prescription medications. His marriage to Priscilla had ended. His management controlled him through a contract that essentially owned his future. The Graceland mansion that had once symbolized his triumph now felt more like a gilded cage. For Elvis, the Lisa Marie represented something precious: autonomy. When he boarded that aircraft, he was making the decision to go, to move, to escape. In the air, no one could reach him with demands or disappointments. Colonel Parker couldn't call, fans couldn't press against him, photographers couldn't capture his increasingly vulnerable moments. The plane became a cocoon where Elvis could eat what he wanted, sleep when exhaustion finally overtook him, or simply exist without performance. Strauss and his crew understood this implicitly. They kept the flight smooth, the cabin comfortable, and most importantly, they gave Elvis the gift of not having to be Elvis Presley every single moment. The Lisa Marie logged hundreds of hours crisscrossing America, carrying Elvis between concert venues, back home to Memphis, or sometimes just flying because flying felt like freedom. Strauss maintained meticulous flight logs, each entry a small notation of altitude, airspeed, and destination, data that would later read like a map of Elvis's final years. The crew developed rhythms and routines, learned Elvis's preferences and moods, became part of the small universe that revolved around the man who had changed music forever. They couldn't have known that their service would become part of history's most examined final chapter, or that the aircraft they maintained with such care would transform from a working plane into a monument before they were ready to let it go. But even 30,000 feet above the earth couldn't protect Elvis from what was coming. In the summer of 1977, every flight would take on a weight that Captain Strauss and his crew couldn't yet comprehend. Turbulence behind the glamour. The flight logs told a story that the concert posters and album covers never could. Captain Ron Strauss would flip through the leather-bound logbook during quiet moments in the cockpit, his eyes tracing the dates and destinations that mapped Elvis Presley's relentless schedule. February, 6 flights between Memphis and various cities for recording sessions. March, 11 flights supporting a grueling concert tour through the Midwest. April, 9 more crisscrossing the South. The numbers painted a picture of perpetual motion, a man who seemed to be running from something he could never outpace. What the logbook couldn't capture was the increasing heaviness that Strauss and his crew witnessed each time Elvis climbed the stairs into the Lisa Marie. By 1977, the contrast between the public Elvis and the private man had become almost unbearable to witness. On stage, he still commanded attention, still possessed that indefinable quality that made thousands of people feel like he was singing directly to them. The jumpsuits had grown more elaborate, encrusted with more stones and metallic thread, as if additional layers of showmanship could compensate for the energy that was quietly draining away. But backstage in the limousines, and especially on the Lisa Marie, the mask would slip. Strauss noticed how Elvis moved more slowly, how he would pause at the top of the aircraft stairs to catch his breath, how his face had taken on a puffy, exhausted quality that no amount of stage makeup could fully disguise. The aircraft that had been designed as a palace of comfort became something else entirely: a medical station, a refuge, sometimes a prison. The bedroom suite saw more use than Elvis had probably intended when he designed it. Flights that should have been social occasions, filled with the Memphis Mafia's laughter and card games, increasingly found Elvis retreating to that back room, the door closing with a soft click that signaled he wanted solitude. The crew would hear nothing for hours, just the steady hum of the engines and the occasional creak of the airframe. Strauss learned not to disturb him during these withdrawals. Sometimes rest was the only medicine that worked. The signs of decline accumulated like storm clouds on a horizon. Strauss and his co-pilots exchanged glances when Elvis would board with unsteady steps, when his words came slowly or slurred at the edges. The prescription bottles that occasionally appeared on the cabin tables spoke their own language, names like Demerol, Dilaudid, Percodan forming a pharmaceutical vocabulary that the crew recognized but felt powerless to address. This was Elvis Presley. Who had the authority or the courage to suggest that the king needed help he wasn't getting? The Memphis Mafia, that rotating cast of friends and employees who surrounded Elvis, seemed caught in the same paralysis. Everyone saw. No one knew how to intervene in a way that wouldn't cost them their position in Elvis's shrinking world. The Lisa Marie became a witness to moments both tender and troubling. There were flights where Elvis would emerge from the bedroom refreshed, engaging the crew in conversation, asking about their families, demonstrating the genuine warmth that had made him beloved beyond his talent. He would sit in the main cabin eating sandwiches, his taste for simple comfort food never diminished despite the gourmet meals that could have been prepared, and talk about movies he wanted to make, songs he wanted to record, plans that suggested hope for a future beyond the next concert. Those flights reminded Strauss why he had come to care about this complicated man, why the job had evolved from professional duty into something closer to protective devotion. But other flights painted darker pictures. There were times when Elvis seemed disconnected from the world passing below, staring through the windows with eyes that didn't seem to register the changing landscapes. Conversations would trail off mid-sentence, thoughts left incomplete, as if the effort of maintaining them exceeded his reserves. The crew developed an unspoken protocol for these flights: maintain course, minimize disruption, give him space to exist in whatever internal world he inhabited. Strauss would monitor his instruments with extra attention during these journeys, as if keeping the aircraft perfectly stable could somehow steady the passenger struggling in the cabin behind him. The schedule never relented. Colonel Parker kept booking dates and Elvis kept showing up, kept boarding the Lisa Marie for another flight to another city and another performance. The tour machine had its own momentum, and stopping it seemed as impossible as turning the aircraft around mid-flight without authorization. Strauss sometimes wondered if Elvis wanted someone to make that decision for him, to ground him literally and figuratively, to give him permission to rest. But the financial pressures were enormous: Graceland's upkeep, the payroll for dozens of employees, the lifestyle that had expanded to fill every dollar Elvis earned, and then some. The plane kept flying because stopping meant confronting questions no one wanted to answer. The crew of the Lisa Marie existed in a strange bubble of knowledge and helplessness. They saw what the fans didn't, what even some of Elvis's closest associates chose not to acknowledge. They witnessed the toll that fame, excess, and exhaustion were extracting from a man who had given the world so much joy. Strauss would complete his post-flight checks with increasing unease, a growing sense that they were all participants in something heading toward an inevitable conclusion. The aircraft was sound, the crew was skilled, but the passenger they carried was flying on fumes, and everyone in the cockpit knew it. In August 1977, the Lisa Marie would make one more routine flight home to Memphis. Nothing in the logbook would mark it as different from hundreds of other journeys, but this flight would haunt Captain Strauss for the rest of his life, the last flight home. The weather was clear that day in mid-August, the kind of flying conditions that pilots appreciate without much thought. Captain Ron Strauss conducted his pre-flight inspection of the Lisa Marie with the same careful attention he brought to every departure, walking the exterior of the aircraft, checking systems, reviewing the flight plan. Elvis had been on a short trip, one of those brief journeys that barely seemed worth firing up the jet's massive engines, but that was the nature of the job. When Elvis wanted to go home, they took him home. The destination that day was Memphis International Airport, a route Strauss could have flown with his eyes closed. Everything about the flight appeared routine in the logbook he would fill out later, but routine was not the word that would stick in his memory. Elvis boarded without fanfare in the early afternoon. Strauss noticed immediately that something felt different, though he would struggle for years afterward to articulate exactly what that difference was. It wasn't that Elvis looked worse than usual. If anything, he seemed relatively steady on his feet as he climbed the stairs. It wasn't that he appeared upset or agitated. The strangeness was more subtle, an absence rather than a presence. Elvis moved through the cabin with a kind of deliberate quietness, as if he were already half removed from the moment. He settled into one of the main cabin seats, the leather creaking softly under his weight, and turned his face toward the window. The engines spooled up with their familiar whine, and the Lisa Marie began its taxi to the runway. Strauss went through his checklist with practiced efficiency, exchanging the necessary communications with his co-pilot and the tower. The takeoff was smooth, the aircraft lifting into the afternoon sky with the powerful grace of its design. Behind them, the city fell away, growing smaller and less distinct. In the cabin, Elvis sat motionless, his attention fixed on something beyond the window, clouds perhaps, or simply the endless blue that stretched in every direction. The crew had seen him in contemplative moods before, but this felt deeper, more complete. It was as if he had decided to be somewhere else entirely while his body made the journey home. The flight would last less than 2 hours, a short hop by the standards of the Lisa Marie's capabilities. Normally, such flights included at least some interaction. Elvis might ask for food, might flip through magazines, might emerge at some point to stretch his legs or chat briefly with whoever was nearby. The Memphis Mafia members who often traveled with him would play cards, tell jokes, fill the cabin with the casual noise of friendship. But this flight carried a strange weight of silence. Even the usual passengers seemed subdued, speaking in low voices if they spoke at all. The cabin felt less like a flying mansion and more like a chapel, a space where people instinctively lowered their voices and moved with care. Strauss checked his instruments and maintained course, but part of his attention remained focused on what was happening behind the cockpit door. He couldn't see Elvis from his position, but he could sense the unusual stillness. During a routine check-in with the cabin, one of the flight attendants mentioned quietly that Elvis hadn't asked for anything, hadn't moved from his seat, just kept watching the world pass below. There was concern in her voice, the kind that came from knowing someone well enough to recognize when their silence meant something. Strauss acknowledged the information and returned his attention to flying, but the unease settled deeper into his chest. The landscape below shifted from the greens and browns of rural terrain to the more developed areas approaching Memphis. The mighty Mississippi River came into view, that ancient waterway that had witnessed so much American history, including the rise of a poor boy from Tupelo who had transformed music itself. Strauss began his descent procedures, contacting Memphis Approach Control, receiving clearance for landing. The Lisa Marie dropped altitude smoothly, the engines changing pitch as power settings adjusted. Through it all, Elvis remained at his window, a silhouette against the afternoon light, utterly still. The landing was textbook perfect, the kind that passengers barely feel. The wheels touched the Memphis International runway with hardly a bump, and the aircraft rolled out with decreasing speed. Strauss guided the Lisa Marie to its designated parking area, the familiar territory of home base. The engines wound down, their powerful roar fading to a whine and then to silence. In that moment after shutdown, when the aircraft transitions from a living machine to an inert object, Strauss felt an unexpected chill. Something about this flight had been wrong in ways he couldn't name, a wrongness that lived in the spaces between normal events rather than in anything obviously alarming. Elvis finally moved, rising from his seat with visible effort. He made his way to the exit, pausing briefly at the top of the stairs before descending to the tarmac. Strauss watched from the cockpit window as Elvis walked to the waiting car, his movement slow but steady. There was no wave, no acknowledgement, just a man going home after another flight. The car pulled away, and the Lisa Marie sat empty on the concrete, the afternoon sun reflecting off its polished surface. Strauss began his post-flight procedures, filling out the logbook with dates and times and fuel consumption, all the data that made flight operations possible. He wrote the destination, Memphis. He noted the landing time. He closed the book without any sense that he had just completed the final entry in a chapter of history. 2 days later, everything would change. The phone call would come, and Captain Strauss would learn that the quiet man who had stared out the window during that strange, silent flight would never board the Lisa Marie again. The news that shook the cockpit. August 16, 1977 began like any other day for Captain Ron Strauss. He had no flight scheduled, no reason to expect that this Tuesday would be anything other than routine maintenance checks and paperwork. He was going about his normal business when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was shaking, the words coming in fragments that didn't immediately make sense. Elvis was dead. The king of rock and roll had been found unresponsive at Graceland. Emergency crews had tried to revive him. Nothing had worked. He was gone. The first response was disbelief, that automatic rejection of information too large and terrible to process. Strauss had just seen Elvis 2 days ago. Yes, he had looked tired. Yes, he had been quiet, but dead. At 42 years old, the mind scrambled for alternative explanations for ways this could be a mistake or a cruel rumor. But the calls kept coming, each one confirming what the previous one had said, each conversation adding small details that made the impossible real. Graceland was in chaos. The media had already descended. Fans were gathering at the gates. Elvis Presley, the man who had changed American culture, who had made the Lisa Marie necessary in the first place, was gone. Strauss felt the news like a physical blow, a sensation in his chest that had nothing to do with medical emergency and everything to do with loss. This wasn't just the death of an employer or even a famous client. Over the years of flying Elvis across the country, of witnessing his private moments and guarding his vulnerabilities, something deeper had developed. Respect, certainly, affection, absolutely, and a kind of protective instinct that came from seeing someone powerful revealed as fragile. Now all those flights, all those quiet observations, all that accumulated knowledge of who Elvis really was in his unguarded moments, felt suddenly precious and unbearably sad. The man who had sought peace in the sky would never fly again. The flight crew gathered in stunned silence, each person processing the news in their own way. Some cried openly. Others sat with blank faces, words failing them entirely. They shared memories in fragments. The time Elvis had thanked them personally for a smooth flight through bad weather, the Christmas bonuses that were always generous, the way he would sometimes emerge from the bedroom just to check on how they were doing. These small moments, unremarkable at the time, now carried enormous weight. They were the last people to have flown with Elvis, the last crew to have served him in the air. That final flight, with its strange silence and Elvis's fixed gaze out the window, replayed in everyone's mind with new and terrible significance. News of Elvis's death spread across the world with shocking speed. Radio stations interrupted their programming. Television networks broke into regular broadcasts. Within hours, the entire planet seemed to know that Elvis Presley was dead, his heart finally giving out under the accumulated strain of years of excess and prescription drug abuse. The details would emerge slowly: the bathroom at Graceland where he had collapsed, the frantic attempts at resuscitation, the official cause of death that would be debated and questioned for decades to come. But for those who had been part of Elvis's daily life, the how mattered less than the simple, devastating fact of absence. Graceland transformed overnight from a private home into a pilgrimage site. Thousands of fans gathered outside the music gates, many traveling from across the country as soon as they heard the news. They brought flowers, teddy bears, handwritten notes expressing love and grief. They sang Elvis's songs through their tears, creating an impromptu memorial that would continue for days. Inside the mansion, family and close friends struggled with arrangements and shock, trying to honor Elvis while dealing with their own crushing loss. The machinery of death, funeral preparations, official statements, legal matters, ground forward even as hearts broke. At Memphis International Airport, the Lisa Marie sat grounded and silent. The aircraft that had been a symbol of Elvis's freedom and success now felt like a relic, a beautiful object suddenly stripped of purpose. Strauss found himself returning to look at it, drawn by something he couldn't name. The plane appeared unchanged, the same gleaming exterior, the same luxurious interior waiting for a passenger who would never come. But everything was different now. The gold-plated fixtures seemed less glamorous and more sad. The bedroom where Elvis had sought rest felt haunted by absence. The windows he had stared through on that last flight now looked out on a world that had lost something irreplaceable. The crew understood that their lives had changed in ways both practical and profound. There would be no more flights with Elvis, no more schedules to maintain, no more responsibility for safely transporting the king. The Lisa Marie would remain, but its purpose had died with its owner. In the days following Elvis's death, as the world mourned and Memphis prepared for a funeral that would draw tens of thousands, Strauss and his fellow crew members existed in a strange limbo. They were part of history now, witnesses to the final chapter, keepers of memories that the rest of the world would never access. The weight of that knowledge settled on them like fog, heavy and inescapable. In the years that followed, as legends grew and myths multiplied, Captain Strauss would carry the truth of those final days in silence, until the time came to speak, to honor the man behind the legend with the one story only he could tell. Echoes above the clouds. The years passed, and the world's obsession with Elvis Presley never faded. If anything, death had transformed him from a troubled superstar into an immortal icon, frozen forever at the peak of his cultural power. Books were written, documentaries were filmed, impersonators made careers out of copying his moves and voice. Graceland opened to the public, allowing millions of fans to walk through the rooms where Elvis had lived, to see the jumpsuits and gold records and personal possessions that told the story of an extraordinary life. But for Captain Ron Strauss, Elvis remained something simpler and more human. A man he had known, flown with, and quietly worried about during those final difficult years. Strauss had kept his silence for a long time. In the immediate aftermath of Elvis's death, reporters had tried to reach him, hungry for any insider perspective on the king's final days. He had declined every interview, feeling that speaking publicly would be a betrayal of the trust Elvis had placed in him and his crew. The cockpit had been a space of privacy, and what Strauss had witnessed there felt sacred in some way, not material for headlines or sensational stories. But as decades passed and misinformation spread, as people who had barely known Elvis sold stories and made claims, Strauss felt a different kind of responsibility emerging. Someone needed to tell the truth about that last flight, not for publicity or profit, but for the historical record. When he finally spoke, his account was measured and respectful. He described Elvis as he had truly been, generous, kind, but deeply troubled by pressures that would have crushed a lesser person. He talked about the toll that fame extracted, how being Elvis Presley every waking moment had worn away at the man underneath the legend. He spoke of that final flight with careful precision, recalling the silence, the stillness, the sense of someone already beginning to slip away from the world. There was no drama in his telling, no attempt to inflate his own importance or claim special insight he didn't possess. He had been the pilot. He had done his job, and he had witnessed something that still haunted him decades later. The Lisa Marie itself became part of the Graceland experience, permanently grounded and converted into an exhibit that visitors could tour. Fans walked through the same cabin where Elvis had sat, marveled at the gold fixtures and custom furniture, took photographs next to the bed where he had sought refuge during those endless tours. The aircraft that had once represented freedom and movement now stood as a monument to excess and tragedy, beautiful and sad in equal measure. For Strauss, seeing it transformed into a museum piece brought complicated emotions. Pride in the work he had done maintaining and flying such a magnificent machine. Sorrow that its most important passenger had needed it as an escape from a life that should have brought joy. In his later years, Strauss would reflect on what it meant to have been part of Elvis's story. He hadn't been there at the beginning, during the revolutionary days of Sun Records and the scandalous television appearances. He hadn't been present for the Hollywood years or the comeback special that had revitalized Elvis's career. His role had been at the end, flying a man home for the last time without knowing that's what it was. That final flight had been unremarkable in almost every way. Good weather, smooth landing, routine procedures all followed correctly. But it had also been profound, carrying a weight that only became visible in retrospect. The sky had belonged to Elvis in those moments above the clouds, offering him something the ground never could: distance, perspective, and temporary peace from the demands that consumed him. Strauss had been privileged to give him that gift, to pilot him through air that existed outside the reach of cameras and crowds and crushing expectations. When he thought about Elvis now, it wasn't the jumpsuits or hit songs that came to mind first. It was a quiet figure at a window, watching the world pass below, looking for something that remained forever out of reach. The king had flown high, but he had never quite found the freedom he was searching for. That truth, more than any sensational detail, was what Captain Ron Strauss wanted people to understand. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.